My name is Irina. I am 41 years old, and for the last 6 years, I have been the only person in the family who took care of our mother after a stroke. On Tuesday evening at 10 minutes to 9, when I was about to go to bed after a normal day, work, dinner, helping my mom with evening routines, my brother Maxim sent the message consists of only 11 words. "You need to transfer the house to me. The lawyer is already preparing the documents." I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of cold tea and reread this message 3 times because I didn't understand what a lawyer had to do with it if my mother was still capable, talking, getting to know everyone. And at that very moment, she was sitting in the next room, watching some kind of travel program. I replied in one word: "Explain." And then, instead of a text, Maxim sent a 47-second voice message. I turned it on, waiting for an explanation about inheritance, documents, taxes. But at the end of this voicemail, he uttered one phrase that he clearly wasn't going to say out loud so that someone could hear it, because he had forgotten, or never knew, that the recorder in my phone had been recording his every call for 6 months. Not because I was preparing a case against him, but because one day I got tired of proving with words what the echo of his own voice could prove. Welcome to the Quiet Truth Channel, where the loudest demands usually turn out to be the weakest arguments. If there is also a person in your family who appears only when it comes to money or inheritance, please like and subscribe, because this story begins with a simple text message on Tuesday evening and ends with a conversation that split our family into before and after. And I want you to hear every word of this story, because there is not a single moment in it that I would come up with for effect or embellish for the sake of a beautiful ending. Everything you're about to hear really happened that way, minute by minute, in the apartment where I've been living with my mom for 6 years now. I work as an accountant auditor in a construction company, and this profession imposed an imprint on absolutely everything in my life, including how I listen to voice messages from my family. An ordinary person hears the emotion first: resentment, irritation, intonation. I can hear the number and the date. This is a professional deformity, but it was she who saved my life once, literally. And then, on Tuesday evening, she saved my apartment and my mother's future. There was only one figure in Maxim's voicemail, but it was weighty. "The house is worth about $14 million, and I'm not going to wait for you to appropriate it under the pretext of leaving." The word "appropriate" hung in the air of the kitchen, as if I had stolen something secretly, instead of driving my mother to physical therapy across town during rush hour for 6 years in a row, paying for a weekend nurse out of my own salary, getting up at night because my mother once couldn't reach anyone, and I lay on the bathroom floor for 40 minutes until I heard the sound of falling through the wall. Maxim didn't call Mom is 3 months away from this voicemail. The last time he came to her birthday party was in March. He brought a bouquet of tulips from the supermarket at home, handed them over with a smile, on duty, took a picture with his mother for a family album, and left 40 minutes later because he had business, which, as it turned out later from mutual acquaintances, was called going bowling with friends. Mom was holding these tulips in her hands all evening and seemed to be trying not to show that she was upset. And I was clearing the birthday cake off the table, which we didn't even have time to cut properly with the whole family, because the whole family didn't actually exist that evening. I put my phone face down on the table and went out onto the balcony, because over the past 6 years, I've learned one ironclad rule that no one taught me at university, but which cost me several ruined family evenings. Never answer at the moment when everything inside is clenching into a knot. A reply sent in a fit of anger costs you a year of negotiations, and sometimes an entire relationship. I started smoking, even though I quit 3 years ago, the very month my mother was admitted to the hospital for the first time. "One cigarette won't kill," I told myself, standing on the balcony of the 6th floor and looking at the lighted windows of the neighboring house, where, judging by the silhouettes, someone had an ordinary, calm Tuesday evening without dictaphones and demands to rewrite real estate. I forced myself to remember, not today's message, but the entire chain that led to it, because no one in the world starts demanding someone else's house just like that, one fine Tuesday. It's been under construction for years, brick by brick. You just don't notice the foundation until you see the finished building as a whole. If you dig very deep, the roots of this story go back to our childhood. Maxim is 4 years younger than me, and I still remember how my father, when he was alive, always introduced him to guests as the heir to the family name, and me as just the eldest, the housekeeper. No one in the family considered this to be unfair, because that was the way it was accepted, and that was how all the neighbors and friends in our yard lived. Since I was 12 years old, I washed the dishes after every meal, while Maxim was playing in the yard, and then, it seemed to me, that this was a completely normal distribution of roles. I remember one New Year's Eve, when I was 14 and Maxim was 10. The guests left after midnight, and I washed the plates and cleared the table alone until 2 in the morning. My brother was already asleep in his room, and my parents, going into the kitchen to get water, only briefly said, "Well done for helping," as if it could not have been otherwise. And then I really wanted to hear at least, "Thank you, you helped us a lot today." But instead, a phrase sounded that just, she was consolidating her already familiar role. Mom, by the way, also grew up in the same logic, and, it seems, sincerely did not notice how she repeats the same scenario with us, her children. I'm not telling you this to make excuses for my brother. There can be no excuses. But so that you understand that what happened on Tuesday night was not a sudden attack of greed on his part. It was a logical continuation of the role he had been given as a child, and which he seemed to have taken for granted all his life. The first request I remembered, standing on that balcony, happened even before my mother's stroke, 7 years ago, when Maxim urgently needed to close a loan for a car, 120,000 rubles. "Literally, for 2 weeks, my bonus will come soon." The award did not arrive after either 2 weeks or 2 months. I didn't remind him, because then it seemed to me that reminding my brother of his duty was something petty, unworthy of a real family. When my mother found out about this situation, she told me that Maxim just needed a little help getting back on his feet after a difficult period at work. And of course, I agreed, because at that moment, I sincerely wanted to believe that I was helping in a family way, and not just covering up someone else's irresponsibility with my own money. Although, deep down, even then, I felt a slight pang of doubt, which I chose to ignore for the sake of peace in the family. Then there was his divorce, after which he temporarily lived with his mother for 8 months in a 2-room apartment, where only she had lived before, and for all these 8 months, he did not pay a ruble for communal services or groceries, although he worked steadily and received a good salary. Mom explained to me on the phone, a little embarrassed, that it's hard for him right now. He's a man. He needs time to come to his senses." I nodded into the phone and was silent, because at that moment I had my own job, my own bills, my own anxiety, and no one ever called to ask if it was psychologically difficult for me. And then I had a stroke. Mom was alone in the apartment at the time. She fell in the kitchen, and it's good that the neighbor downstairs heard the crash and called an ambulance. The doctors spoke bluntly then. Another 20 minutes of delay, and the result could be completely different. I remember that night in the emergency room as clearly as if it were yesterday, not 6 years ago. Stiff plastic chairs, the smell of bleach, a bulletin board with faded postcards, a coffee machine in the corner of the hallway that didn't work that night, no matter how many times I pressed the buttons, and me calling my brother at 2 a.m. because I couldn't tell anyone else the news. My voice must have sounded so serious that even over the phone, it was clear how serious the situation was. But Maxim said he would come as soon as he could, and didn't arrive until the next day, explaining that he didn't want to panic before time and disturb the doctor's work at night. I sat in that waiting room alone until morning, listening to the nurses chatting in the hallway, and praying to hear something definite about my mother's condition. And when I finally received the doctor's diagnosis at 7 a.m., there was no one to call, because everyone I could have called was still asleep. When she was paralyzed on the left side of her body, and it became clear that one of us needed to take on the constant care, the family council, if you could even call it that, consisted of a single phone call, during which Maxim said a phrase that I remember word for word, because it defined the next 6 years of my life. "You don't work on a construction site with your hands. You have a flexible schedule, and it's more convenient for you." A flexible schedule for an accountant during the season of quarterly and annual reports was a joke that I somehow believed at the time, because it was easier to believe it than to argue with my brother in the midst of a family disaster when my nerves were already on edge. That's how I ended up taking care of my mother. It wasn't because I was the kindest of the two of us. It was because I was the most convenient. The first weeks after her discharge from the hospital were the most challenging, as we had to completely reconfigure the apartment, remove the doorways, install handrails in the bathroom, purchase a special bed with an adjustable headboard, and order a wheelchair, which turned out to be a meticulous process, as we had to try out different models because my mother didn't tolerate narrow or rigid ones. Maxim then offered to chip in half for all this equipment, and to be honest, I was glad of this offer as proof that we could still do it together. But when it came time to pay the bill for the medical bed and handrails, and it turned out to be almost 40,000 rubles, Maxim wrote that he was not at a good moment and asked me to close the account, promising to return half literally next week. This week has never come, not once in 6 years. Although, I admit, in all these years, I have never written to him directly. "Maxim, you owe me 20,000 for a bed." It always seemed to me that saying this phrase out loud meant turning my family into an accounting department, and I was afraid of this transformation more than anything else in the world. Finding the right weekend caregiver wasn't easy either. The first woman I hired through an agency lasted only 2 weeks and quit, saying that it's too hard mentally to see my daughter torn between work and her mother alone, without the support of the rest of the family. The second one, which I found through friends, turned out to be rude. And once, when I returned earlier than expected, I found Mom had been sitting in her wet underwear for about 20 minutes because the nurse was just about to come over. I fired her that evening, despite the fact that I had paid for a month in advance, and for 3 weeks I searched for a replacement on my own, taking over the entire weekend without a single break, postponing my own vacation and meetings with friends over and over again, until finally I found someone I could really trust. Finally, Lyudmila Petrovna was found, who stayed with us for a long time and once told me a phrase that I remember. That in 20 years of working in this field, she had seen dozens of similar families, and almost always the one with less money and fewer connections was courted, not the one with more free time, because everyone has free time if they really want to. She added that she had seen families where the caring person did not dare to raise the issue of justice to the very end, and later regretted this silence more than the severity of the care. I felt uneasy at the time, because I recognized her words as a description of my situation with Maxim, only spoken aloud by a stranger who had seen dozens of similar stories in other families and was not surprised to hear ours. My work situation was also challenging from the beginning. I had a conversation with my manager in the first month after my mother's stroke, explaining that I would need to take occasional midday breaks to respond to urgent doctor or ambulance calls. My manager, an older woman who had experienced a similar situation with her own father, was understanding and granted me a flexible schedule in exchange for my completing my reports in the evenings and on weekends. She even told me in a friendly manner that she saw me as a reflection of herself from 15 years ago, when she had to juggle work and caring for her father alone. This is why Maxim's comment about my flexible schedule hurt me so deeply, as it was not a gift from fate, but a result of my own double workload, which my brother had never asked about in detail. There was a period, about the second year after the stroke, which I call the Black Winter, because then everything came together at the same time. Mom had pneumonia, and we spent almost 3 weeks in the hospital, where I spent the night on a cot next to her bed, because there were not enough staff in the ward to constantly look after bedridden patients. At the same time, I myself started having problems with my back from my mother's constant lifting and turning over, and the orthopedic doctor bluntly told me that if I did not reconsider the load, I risked being in the hospital myself earlier than I expected. At the same time, the physiotherapist who was working with my mother on recovery advised me a special belt for my back and showed me the correct lifting technique, because, according to him, he had seen too many caring relatives who, after a few years, became patients themselves due to improper loads which no one warned them about in time, and added that this is perhaps the most underestimated problem among those who have been caring for loved ones alone for years. At that time, for the first time in many years, I called Maxim not with a request, but almost with a cry for help, honestly telling him about the back pain and the 3-week hospital. He replied that he had an important project at work and that he would call back in a couple of days when he was free. He never made that call to me, and I still remember sitting in the hospital hallway with my phone in my hand, waiting for at least some kind of response. But I never got it. It was this winter, and not one specific one, that became an internal turning point for me, after which I stopped waiting for my brother to take the initiative and simply began to act as if his help did not exist in principle, which, in fact, was true. And here I have to say something for which I may be judged by some of you who watch such stories and wait for the perfect heroine without a single flaw. I wasn't the saintly nurse from the social responsibility commercial. For the first 2 years, I was angry almost every day, sometimes several times a day. I was angry when I changed the bedclothes at 3 in the morning and simultaneously wrote my mom the annual report on the messenger phone because the deadline at work did not ask if someone in the family had a stroke. I was angry when Maxim sent photos from the sea with the caption, "Finally taking a break from all this stress," as if it was he who was experiencing stress in our family, and not my mother, who was paralyzed in half of her body, and not me, who went to rehab with her 3 times a week, holding her healthy hand in a crowded bus. I was angry when my daughter Sonia, who was 14 at the time, asked me why I never went to her school concerts, but I couldn't explain to her that my grandmother was unwell that evening, and I was afraid to leave her alone for at least 2 hours. But you can't get away from anger if it doesn't turn into a plan. That's why I created a regular spreadsheet in the Notes app, then moved it to a separate file on my computer. Not to prove anything to anyone at that moment, for myself, so that at night, when despair and the thought, "Why me?" came over me, I could open my phone and see in black and white, that's how many hours of care. That's how much money from my salary was spent on medicines and a weekend nurse. That's how many of my daughter's birthdays I missed or reduced to 40 minutes because that mom was sick that day. This table was not a weapon. She was my way of staying sane, proving to myself that my life was really happening and not dissolving into an endless, repetitive day. There was one particular evening that I remember more often than others when I explained to myself why this table was needed at all. Sonia was 16 at the time, and she had a graduation party at music school. She had been playing the piano for 7 years, and this was her last, most important concert before exams. I bought a ticket, took time off from work, and arranged with a neighbor to sit with my mom for 2 hours. But an hour before the concert, Mom got sick. Blood pressure rose sharply. Dizzy, she began to confuse words, and I, of course, called an ambulance and stayed at home, instead of going to the assembly hall of the School of Arts. Sonia played her program and, looking around the hall, did not find me among the audience. She did not cry, and did not make a scene when I came to her in the evening with an apology and flowers, bought at the pharmacy on the corner, because the flower shop had already closed. She just said that she understood. And this calm, adult understanding from a 14-year-old child at that time hurt me much more than if she had been shouting and offended. It was after that evening that I opened the same note in the phone and began to write the first line. Date, event, what had to be canceled or spent. Not to give someone a bill, but so that I myself would not forget that my life and my daughter's life also matter, even when it seems that the whole world has narrowed to one apartment and one disease. Neighbor from above, Aunt Valia, who knows our family for almost 20 years, one day, seeing me out of the house with another package of medicine from the pharmacy, told me on the stairwell the phrase that stuck in me for a long time. Irai, you same you know. When it's over, everyone will tell you one and the house if that's what they'll share differently. Then I laughed, slightly through force, and said, I don't need a house. I'd just survive this year. I didn't understand then how much Aunt Valia would be right about my brother's thoughts, and how I'll have to remember her words on Tuesday night with a recorder in my hands. What no one in the family knew, including Mom, is that 6 months ago, I started recording phone conversations with Maxim. Not paranoia, and not because he had prepared a case against him in advance. And because one day, on work, I needed to consult a lawyer on a completely different issue, on dispute with a lawyer contractor about overdue delivery of materials. And at the end of business talking, when we exchanged some last formalities, I accidentally, almost unambiguously, mentioned her family situation, that I care for Mom alone, and brother lives separately and appears rarely. Lawyer, man of 50 years with tired the eyes of a man who saw hundreds of family bursts in career because of inheritance. Suddenly, he put his papers aside and asked me straight if I had any idea, some evidence of who was spending on Mom all these years. Checks, translations, recordings of conversations where someone recognizes these circumstances. I'm confused. She said she didn't collect anything, specifically because she never thought of it. Situations in such categories. Then he explained what changed for me. Literally everything. That he does not predict the future in our family, and sincerely, I hope I'll never need it. But I'll have to do it if my relative is. At least once, in witnesses or records, recognizes that a caring family member deserves compensation, content, or share in property. It may have the colossal value in the future section of property. Especially if it suddenly happens, it will come to court, because oral agreements and promises in the family are forgotten selectively, and forget they are always in the same wayside. And audio recording? No. I left his office that day a little stunned, as if I were told something. I never thought seriously about what I had ever thought of. That night, still not until the end understanding why, I included in the phone function automatic recording calls with certain contacts and added a number of brother. I didn't write down. For the court initially, if to be until the end of honest before you. I wrote it because that I was tired of my version of events in the family chat has always been declared too emotional and twisted, and the version of Maxim is reasonable and calm, although objectively calm was much more expensive at the cost of so many sleepless nights. I needed not emotions to prove my right. Self, we needed facts that cannot be rewritten by a back number one beautiful voice, an apology message that has been spoken after the truth once. I'm sorry, she said, standing on the balcony, document cigarette, and feeling a slight dizziness from nicotine. I decided not to answer Maxim's text. I called him, and she made a voice even, almost bored, because she noticed that she had noticed in these years pattern. The more calm I say, the more space man on the other end of the line leaves itself to tell the truth, not to defend itself in advance. People are protected from attack. They rarely defend against the questions specified in a quiet voice. I asked him straight, without legal terms, on what basis he wants to rewrite the house on his own, not at least discuss it with his mom, since it's about her property. A pause hung, the pause I heard. He's not just, when he thinks, how many truth can be allowed, to give yourself a specific moment of conversation. As a result, he said that Mom already does not think as before, and that someone should take control in his hands until I convinced her to leave her for the care. And here it is, all philosophy of mine brother, who was in this thought. Concern becomes suspicious activity at the same time when someone else does it, not himself. I asked again, even softer, trying not to give my voice a shudder. Whether my mother herself told him he wasn't thinking, and he talked to her at all the last 3 months, at least, on the phone? Maxim sighed so hard and demonstrative, as if I was an uncomfortable child asking too many uncomfortable questions to adults. And he said he didn't have to report to me when he was calling my mother, and what the house must belong to the one who is capable of managing it, really, not to the one who turned care for an elderly person into a convenient way to clean up property to hands, gradually, step by step. I was silent for 5 seconds, listening to the bottom of the room. The yard is someone running a car. Then she said the phrase that actually was, she thought over the last 2 weeks, since she first felt the conversation about the house sooner or later will happen. Offered to gather all 3 on Saturday at Mom and talk to her personally. Since he is so sure she wants it, let him know. She will say, in her words, without intermediaries. He agreed too quickly, literally in a second, without a single objection, and this alarmed me more than if he had started arguing. And that's when I realized the main thing. He had absolutely no expectation that I would propose a meeting in front of a live witness who could confirm or, on the contrary, refute his version of events. He clearly expected to correspond and call one-on-one, where, if desired, any phrase could be interpreted in his own way, and my mother would simply be presented with the finished document at the notary's office. The 4 days left until Saturday were more difficult for me than I was willing to admit, even to myself. On Thursday evening, I sat in the kitchen and once again reviewed my table of expenses and hours of care over the past 6 years, and the figure in the final row made me truly stop and realize the magnitude of what was happening for the first time in a long time. I won't reveal the figure now, as it will appear later in this story when it landed on my mother's desk. However, I will say that when I saw it in its entirety, I realized that this was no longer just about the house. It was about whether anyone in my family would see the 6 years of my life as something valuable, or if they would continue to treat it as a matter of course, like the air that simply exists and requires no thanks. That night, I had a strange dream that I remember in great detail. I was standing in our old childhood room, the same one where Maxim and I grew up, and instead of wallpaper, there was a printout of my expense table, measuring 1 meter by 1 meter, and my father, who had passed away long ago, was standing nearby, silently staring at it without saying a word. I woke up at 4 in the morning with the feeling that this dream was trying to tell me something important about the justice that I had been putting off for too long. On Friday morning, before going to work, I decided to call the company's lawyer one more time, just to make sure that I wasn't breaking any rules by showing my mother both the notes and the table at the same time. He confirmed that from a legal point of view, I am not doing anything illegal, since it is not about blackmail or extortion, but only about providing information to the owner of the property for him to make an independent decision. He also advised me not to put pressure on Mom emotionally in the conversation, and give her as much time to think as necessary, even if it is not minutes, but weeks, adding that the most common mistake in such situations is the desire to get an answer immediately, at any cost, just to close the disturbing issue as soon as possible. This advice turned out to be unexpectedly valuable, because all that Saturday evening, I kept in mind one simple setting: not to decide for Mom, but just to give her to see the whole picture. On Friday evening, Sonia, my daughter, who has been studying in another city for 2 years and usually calls on Sundays at the same time, so the Friday call itself alarmed me, even before I had time to answer the call. When she heard the tension in my voice, she immediately asked what happened, because my voice was like before a test. I told her briefly about the requirement of Uncle Maxim. Sonia, who is now 19 and who grew up watching 6 years, how I was torn between work, grandmother, and trying to be a mother for her, was silent for a few seconds, and then she told me something that helped to survive the next Saturday: that I am the only person she saw next to her grandmother every single day, and no matter what Uncle Maxim said, I do not have to prove it to anyone. But if I need proof, it is worth just showing them the truth, because it will not be worse. She added another thing that I had not told before, that she remembers how, as a child, She sometimes envied classmates whose mothers were freer and more often at home. But as she grew up, she realized that she had seen next to her an example of a person who does not give up and does not shift difficulties to someone else silently, and that it was this example that shaped her own attitude to difficulties in adult life, much more than any words I could have told her directly. These words from my 19-year-old daughter meant more to me that evening than any support from my adult relatives, because they came from someone who had been watching me closely all these years, rather than judging me from a distance based on fragmentary stories. Saturday came faster than I was mentally prepared for, despite 4 days of preparation. Maxim arrived at the appointed time, which was unusual for him, carrying a folder of documents, neat and new, clearly purchased for this occasion, which, as it turned out later, contained a draft deed prepared by an unknown lawyer. He acted as if the Saturday meeting was a formality before the signing, rather than a real conversation where someone might say no. He even wore the shirt he usually wore for important business meetings. And for some reason, this small detail struck me more than anything else. The fact that he was preparing for a conversation with his own mother in the same way he would prepare for a meeting with a business partner he barely knew. My mother was sitting in her chair by the window, in the same position she always took after her stroke, leaning slightly to the right, and I could see from her face that she was nervous, sensing that something important was happening, but not fully understanding what it was about, because Maxim and I had agreed not to discuss the details with her beforehand, so that her reaction would be genuine rather than pre-planned by either of us. Maxim started from afar, like an experienced negotiator, which, I must admit, he always could be at work. About taking care of the future, about so that no one can challenge the house after, about legal protection of family property from possible problems. Beautiful, streamlined words, behind which there was not a single concrete figure and not a single concrete fact from the last 6 years. Only general phrases that sounded convincing, exactly until someone asked for something more substantial than the intonation of a confident voice. He even brought with him a printed article from the internet about the risks of incapacity after a stroke and laid it in front of my mother, as if it were a medical certificate from her doctor personally, and not a random article from a legal consultation website, which, judging by the font and design, he clearly found and printed just the night before, preparing for the conversation as for a presentation to his superiors, and not as for a family conversation with his own mother, who raised him, and, by the way, still remembers what he was like as a child, when he hid behind her back from any difficult decisions. Mom took this article, put on her glasses, flipped through it for a couple of seconds, and put it aside without saying anything. But it was clear from her face that it was more out of politeness than out of interest. She always reacted this way to any papers that were brought to her with a confident look, as if she was reading not the content, but the intention of the person who brought them. Mom listened to Maxim, nodded, and I could see how she was gradually beginning to agree, just because her son was speaking confidently and convincingly, and confidence in our family has always been perceived as a sign of being right, back in the days when my father was alive, and it was the tone of voice, and not the content of words, that determined who was right in a family dispute. At some point, my mother quietly asked him what I thought about it. Maxim, without blinking, replied that I agreed with him, and that we had already discussed it. This was a direct lie, pronounced so calmly and naturally that I was even taken aback for a second, not knowing how to react. It was this moment, this particular lie, spoken to my mother's face, that served as the final signal for me to no longer put it off. I then took out my phone, turned on the recording of the voice message he had sent me on Tuesday evening, and simply pressed play, placing the phone in the middle of the table between the three of us. His voice filled the kitchen, slightly distorted but unmistakable, repeating the same words about the 14 million and how he was not going to wait for me to take over the house under the pretext of leaving. For a moment, the room was completely silent, with the exception of the occasional car passing by outside, and the contrast between the normal sounds of the street and what had just transpired within the apartment felt almost surreal. My mother turned her head slowly. She had difficulty moving after her stroke, but her gaze remained as clear and sharp as I remembered it from my childhood, when she had the ability to stop any argument between my brother and me with a single look. And she looked at her son in a way I had never seen her look at him before in my life. Maxim's face turned pale, and he asked if I had recorded him and if it was legal. I replied calmly, staring directly at him, that recording a conversation without the consent of the other party was legal in our country, as long as it was not used for blackmail or coercion, and that I was using it for one purpose only: to ensure that my mother heard the truth directly from his own lips, rather than through anyone else's retelling, including my own. This was not an act of revenge, despite what some members of the family might have thought later in the family chat. It was my last attempt to prevent the story of my life from being rewritten for the third or fourth time in a row. Next, I pulled out my folder. Yes, I had a folder for this conversation too, but it was not a draft of a will, but rather a printout of the 6-year spreadsheet, the dates of my doctor's visits, down to the day, the receipts for my medications and the nurse's care, the monthly breakdown of my expenses, and the number of nights I had spent without proper sleep, recorded as honestly as I could. There were also printouts of correspondence with the agency's caregivers, copies of prescriptions for the medications my mother still takes twice a day, and even a schedule of my visits to the neurologist and physical therapist with my mother, all of which were listed in chronological order on paper, making it look like a separate unpaid job that had been going on for 6 years, without a single day off. As I was putting the folder together the night before, I had a strange feeling, as if for the first time in my life, I was preparing a resume not for an employer, but for my own family, proving my right to be noticed and heard. I didn't read it all out loud. There was no need for that, and to be honest, I didn't have the strength to do so at the time. I silently placed the folder on the table next to his draft of the deed of gift, and trying to keep my voice steady, I told my mother that Maxim was offering to transfer the house to himself, citing his concern for her future. But I wanted her to consider both documents before making a decision. Mom took both folders in her healthy right hand. She was silent for a long time, longer than I've ever seen her silent. Then she said something that neither of us seemed to have expected to hear at that moment. That she wouldn't be transferring the house to either of us right now, and she didn't intend to do so in such a rush, but she wanted us both to know that she had heard the recording, and she hadn't been deaf for the past 3 years, as some people might have assumed. She had simply chosen not to intervene in our disputes, hoping that we would handle things on our own, like adults. And it seemed that she had been wrong in that hope. Maxim tried to say something about my manipulation and the inadmissibility of recording without warning, but my mother raised her healthy hand, the same gesture she had used to silence us as children at the dinner table, and to my surprise, he actually fell silent. It wasn't a happy ending, and I'll be completely honest with you, because this isn't a fictional story with a beautiful resolution of all conflicts in one evening. Maxim didn't stay for tea, even though my mother, as was her habit, offered to make it. He took his folder with the unfinished deed and left, slamming the front door so hard and loudly that my mother winced. And I spent the next 10 minutes sitting next to her, holding her hand as she calmed down. I remember that I automatically stroked her shoulder and repeated that everything would be fine, even though I wasn't entirely sure about it at the time. It was just the only thing I could think of to say. When we were alone, my mother looked out the window for a long time before quietly, almost in a whisper, apologizing to me. She said that she had watched me carry the burden for so many years, and she had remained silent because she believed that if she started comparing the two of us out loud, it would destroy our relationship forever. However, her silence had actually destroyed something else: my confidence in being seen. I didn't know what to say right away, so I just hugged her with my good arm, trying not to cry in front of her, because after 6 years, I'd gotten used to being the one who was strong, not the one who needed comfort. But that evening, alone in my room, I cried for what felt like an hour, not out of resentment toward my brother, but out of a strange sense of relief that my mother had finally seen me for who I truly was, even if it came at a painful cost, and out of the realization that all those years of silent misunderstanding between us were finally starting to dissipate, like fog after a long night. For the next 2 months, he didn't call me or my mother. Not once, not for any reason, not even formally. 2 weeks after Saturday, the news somehow made its way into the family chat, where about 15 relatives from both my mother's and my father's sides were hanging out. I still don't know if it was Maxim himself who told them, in an attempt to gain support, or if someone they knew passed the story on. But the chat suddenly exploded with messages. Some of the relatives wrote that I had made a fool of my own brother in front of my elderly mother, and that dirty laundry should be cleaned within the family, not with a voice recorder in hand, like in a detective series. A cousin aunt wrote a separate message to me personally, saying that I had gone too far for my own benefit. And one of my uncles even called my mother directly to find out if I had forced her to sign anything against her will, which was especially hurtful to hear, considering whose idea the new will had actually been. However, there were also those who sent me private messages of support. A cousin on my mother's side, who had been taking care of his mother-in-law for several years, honestly admitted that he had long suspected something like this about Maxim and had been on my side in my head for all those years, but had been hesitant to say so in the family chat. I didn't argue or defend myself publicly. I simply stopped responding to these accusations, because during those 2 months of silence, I finally realized one simple thing. It is impossible to convince people who find it psychologically easier to believe in a ready-made version where I am the villain, rather than in a more complex and less convenient truth.